Okay, welcome everyone to this session that we have with a focus on mental health and suicide in the Black community. The film that we've just shown was done by the BBC for the news program, and it gives you a bit of context to this really important issue that has and continue to have a profound effect on some people in our community, and suicide is the ultimate manifestation of some of those issues that we're faced. As was indicated there, we are here to do something that we don't do enough of, which is kind of talk about this matter and to begin to grapple with the issues that emanates from that, and to try and think about how we move forward as families, as communities, as we address this serious condition that creates so many difficulties for people in the community. With us this evening, we have a number of people, professional in various ways, and once I've finished speaking, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Olamide, who is going to do a bit of a presentation, and she'll tell a bit more about herself at the same time. After she's finished, we're going to ask Marilyn, one of our members of the association, who's been very active across the field with us, to share a bit of her own experience and journey. We're then going to have Favour, again, one of our members, who is also a therapist, who's going to share some of our views. And last but not least, we have Mosun, who's a member, but also our consultant psychiatrist, who's going to be with us for this evening. So thank you all for joining. Hopefully you'll find value in the conversation that we're going to have. But to kick us off formally, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Olamide. I say welcome, and over to you. You're muted still.
Hi, thank you so much, Clive. Hello, everyone. My name is, well, first of all, I'm going to start from the beginning and at the end of my presentation. There we go. My name is Dr. Akinwuntan, or Dr. Olamide. I am a trainee psychiatrist. I work in Hertfordshire, in the Hertfordshire Partnership University Foundation Trust. I'm currently based in an early intervention service in Stevenage. So I really related to that lady who said, you know, the service wasn't available and police came and held her down to section her. And I have seen firsthand, as I'm sure many of you would have seen, the impacts of poorly addressed mental health, whether it be at the family level or the individual level or the sort of organizational level. So thank you very much to everyone who's come here. I am going to give a short presentation on suicide prevention.
Sorry, Olamide, I wonder
yes?
if you'd like to put your slideshow on rather than showing all the bits. I think it's probably at the bottom of your screen, slideshow. Yeah, that's it.
There we go. Thank you. As Clive said, suicide is kind of the ultimate end in the negative sense of poorly addressed mental health. And hopefully at the end of this talk, we will see that you don't have to necessarily be a professional to be able to help either yourself or people in your family or your community who you're worried or concerned about. So I'm just going to give a brief background of suicide, warning signs to look out for in yourself or others, and sort of give some pointers as to where you can seek help, how you can help yourself if you're feeling like in a point of crisis whilst you await access to services. And then we can do a brief summary. Dr. Mosun has kindly agreed to answer any questions that people may have about this or other issues later in the session. So what is suicide? It is when someone ends their own life. Previously, people would say, you know, this person committed suicide, but actually now we prefer to say someone has died of suicide, because commit implies, you know, like a crime has been committed, and actually it's not a crime. It's often a cry for help. It's often someone who is coming from a place of so much fear, so much hopelessness, so much desperation that they think that that is the only solution. Suicidal thoughts and feelings can be complex, they can be frightening, they can be confusing, they can be very lonely. So a lot of people who are feeling suicidal don't have the courage to ask for help. There are many things that increase the risk of someone dying by suicide. So you have social factors, we have psychological factors, cultural factors, biological factors, and I'll talk about some of those later on. If we can recognize this as a real issue that we should discuss openly, we can reduce the shame and stigma around it, and hopefully by doing so, we can prevent or lower the incidences of suicides happening in ourselves and in our communities. It's important to note that it's not an inevitable end to serious mental health. It's not an inevitable end to depression. Most people who are suicidal are in that position just because they can't imagine an alternative to their situation. So hopefully at the end of this talk, we will all see that there are alternatives to the situation. There's a common misconception that if you talk to someone about suicide, if you ask someone if they're feeling suicidal, that you put their thoughts in their head and then make it happen. But actually the opposite is true. Most people who end up committing suicide were already thinking that. It's not by asking someone if they're feeling that way that they then go, ooh, this is an option. So actually by talking about it, you're more likely to offer them some help and reassure them that, there are options. So just a couple of facts and figures. There were just above 5,500 suicides in England and Wales in 2021. 3/4 of these were males, and this has been the trend since the mid-1990s. Consistently, for every woman who kills herself, there are 3 men who kill themselves. And some of this is because men have tended to use more violent methods, and violent methods are harder to kind of turn back from. If someone takes an overdose, you can call an ambulance. But if someone jumps off a 10-story building, there's kind of less you can do. There are also factors such as men not feeling as open or able to discuss their feelings, more stigma about men being soft, pressures of being a man to provide, and things like that. And since 2010, men aged 45 to 64 years have had the highest age-specific suicide rates. And I certainly see in a lot of popular discourse about suicide, there's a lot of focus on the sort of teenagers, young people, but actually this kind of 45 to 60-year-old group is a very vulnerable group. So it is important for us to note that, because it might not just be your kid or these young teenagers talking to themselves. It might be your friend, it might be your colleague, it might be your dad, it might be your boss. The most common method of suicide in England and Wales for both men and women is hanging, strangulation, or suffocation. They're all grouped as one. And that's 58%, followed by poison, which is 20%. And then jumping or lying in front of a moving object is 4%. And then the rest of the percentage is things like drowning or suffocating in a carbon monoxide in a car. So again, in the media, there's a lot of things about like jumping in front of a train. I guess that's what we see because trains are cancelled, but actually hanging, suffocation, poisoning, things that people can kind of do privately in their own homes are by far the greater proportion of danger. In 2016, the Samaritans had more than 770,000 contacts from people across the UK expressing suicidal feelings. And not just people who were in the process of, making a plan, even people who are thinking like, I've been thinking like was said in the documentary, I'm waking up thinking I don't want to be alive. So 770,000 in 2016, and that's gone up, especially in the wake of things like COVID and the cost of living crisis. There are a lot more immigrants to the UK in recent years because of Brexit, and a lot of those people will struggle with feeling low due to problems like cultural acclimatization, separation from their family and friends, looking for jobs in a new culture. And so there was a self-reported questionnaire done a few years ago, and that showed 20 people saying that they've had thoughts of suicide. So again, it's to reinforce that it's not uncommon. And even if you've not had thoughts of suicide, chances that you know someone who has. And so we should be talking about it, because there's no point of so many people in our community suffering in silence. Oh, next slide. And this is just a little quote from this book, How to Kill a Rock Star. And it's two people having a conversation, one of whom had a suicidal attempt. So one character asks, "Did you really want to die?" And the suicidal person says, "No one commits suicide because they want to die." And she asks them, "Why do they do it?" And the answer is because they want to stop the pain. And I just thought it's a way of reframing this thing of like, oh, this person is just trying to, they're weak or they're helpless. No, it's actually a very, painful, raw, emotional situation for someone to be in. So I talked a bit about the risk factors for suicide. I've grouped them here into biological, psychological, and social. Most of the biological things are things you can't really change. Like if you're young at that point in time. If you're a middle-aged man, you're a middle-aged man, you can't really do much about it. We know that transgender and non-binary people have higher rates of suicide. Having a physical health condition, especially if it causes chronic pain or disability, is a huge risk factor for suicide because these people face so much day-to-day frustration in their lives. And then alcohol and drug misuse, I've included it in biological because it tends to be chronic for a lot of people. Then we have psychological factors. So having poor mental health or even being diagnosed with mental health conditions does increase your risk of of dying by suicide. A sense of hopelessness. So if someone was, say, depressed or they had schizophrenia, even if you're very unwell, but you kind of felt like there's a light at the end of the tunnel, they would be less likely to commit suicide than someone who really felt trapped, didn't have access to help. And then having had a previous attempt in the past increases your risk for dying by suicide because it means you're more likely to try it in the future. And then social factors, again, this is just some of them because there's loads and loads of things, but being isolated socially, someone who doesn't have a lot of friends, someone who doesn't have a strong community, anyone who's socioeconomically disadvantaged or deprived, growing up in a low income community, having parents who don't have a steady income, stressful life events, so going through a divorce or your parents going through a divorce, ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences, so people who've suffered some kind of trauma in their childhood, being a victim of domestic violence. And for some people, it can be something like, difficult exams. Everyone has different resilience thresholds, and we shouldn't judge. We shouldn't say, why is this person feeling suicidal just because of this little thing? Like everyone is different, and you never know what that straw will be to break the camel's back. Involvement with the criminal justice system, particularly people who are in prison. And unfortunately, there's a disproportionate number of Black people in the criminal justice system for both violent and non-violent crimes. And that increases your risk for dying of suicide. It has been shown that people who work as carers in the arts or in low-skilled jobs are more likely to die by suicide. Being unemployed increases your risk of dying by suicide. Poor access to healthcare, the stigma of mental illness in your community, and then also how easily accessible the means of suicide would be. So someone working as a nurse who has access to dangerous drugs, who was feeling low, it'd be easier to get those drugs than someone who wasn't. So warning signs of suicide in yourself or others. If you notice that you're being more anxious or irritable, social withdrawal, so someone who previously would go to church or go out to the cinema, who's suddenly saying, no, I don't want to see anyone. Can I come visit? No. Or if you notice, I don't want to do things anymore. Or conversely, people who start acting really recklessly, buying things they can't afford, driving fast cars. Anyone who has an increasingly negative outlook on life, like everything is just sad, 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 that can just indicate that they're losing that resilience to cope. Making plans or thinking about dying, if you're waking up every day thinking, I don't want to be around anymore, or if you find yourself actually thinking, I would like to jump in front of this train, or if I had this pill, I would take it, that should really alert you that, hold up, something is wrong. If you are, or someone you love is threatening to hurt or kill oneself, again, don't just assume that someone is looking for attention. A lot of the time that is coming from a place of real, like, emotional vulnerability, and it is a cry for help that should be taken seriously. Talking about death, dying, or suicide, again, we shouldn't assume that people are being dramatic or difficult. We should take that seriously as a cry for help, whether in our friends, families, co-workers. We all have a duty of care, I think, to each other as human beings. And then suddenly thanking people or making apologies for no reason. This may be someone who's actually made plans and is kind of trying to make their peace with the world. So if someone suddenly starts, acting like that out of the blue, just, think about how they've been acting recently and see if you need to be worried about them. Another quote about suicide. So talking about suicide with someone you're worried about won't put the idea in their head. It actually takes the power away from the thoughts, and those thoughts are so powerful. It is a relief to know that someone else knows and cares enough to ask. Depression and suicidal thoughts allow for a cycle of isolation, but for someone in your life, you might be the person who can break that. That's by Roxanne McDonald. If someone you know expresses suicidal intent, don't freak out. It can be difficult. You're thinking, what do I say? What do I do? But be open and non-judgmental. Do not criticize or blame them. Listen to them. Ask about how you can help or support them. Encourage them to seek help, and I'll talk about some ways you can do that in a minute. Reassure them that they are not alone, even if you don't know the answers. Sometimes just knowing that someone is willing to listen is helpful. If you think they're in immediate danger, if someone says, I've taken something, I'm about to jump somewhere, then please call the police and get support for yourself. It's not always easy to listen to hard or heavy things, so make sure that you're looking after yourself as well. Places to find help in the UK. You can go to your GP surgery if you're feeling low. You can call NHS 111 if you're not in immediate danger, if you want to be referred to crisis services, for example. The Samaritans are a charity that speaks to people who are feeling low, and they will just be on the phone with you while you talk for 30 minutes, for 1 hour, for 2 minutes, whatever you need. The number is 116123, or you can go on their website. Mind is another mental health charity. They have a lot of resources for mental health conditions in general, not just suicide. And that's their number and their website on there. And if you feel like you're in immediate danger or someone is in immediate danger, then just call 999 and ask for the police and / or the ambulance. If you're feeling really distressed and you're trying to calm yourself, these are some tips that you can use, and they do work. Some people think this is mumbo jumbo, but it does help. It might not take the feelings away, but it will help. Talk to someone. Avoid your triggers as best as you can. If you're drinking a lot of alcohol, try to avoid that. If you're dealing with a lot of difficult family or friends, try to stay away. If you do have friends who party a lot or do drugs, try to stay away from that. Try deep breathing or mindfulness exercises. A really easy one is breath for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds. If you can do that for at least 3 minutes, it will calm kind of your nervous system down and allow you to act more from a place of logic than a place of just your feelings. Try to distract yourself, watch a movie, take a walk, call a friend. If you're religious, you can pray if that helps you. You can exercise if you are so inclined, and that can actually release endorphins and put you in a better mental space. So, in summary, thank you for listening so far. Anyone can feel suicidal. There should be no stigma attached to that. Talking about suicide can be very positive, and it does reduce the incidence of suicide. And like that girl said, she was young and she felt low and she couldn't even talk to her parents because she didn't think that they would get it. So, especially as Black people, we really need to look out for each other and be reassuring our family and friends, I am here, I will listen. Even if I don't understand, I will listen. If you feel low or suicidal, please reach out to someone. Do not suffer in silence. And if you feel unsafe, call 999. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Olamide, for an excellent overview and an introduction following that film also. What we're going to try and do, but please put your thoughts in the chat. We're going to try and get our presenters to present, but by all means, put any questions you have in the chat as we go along, because we are going to very much make this a session where we answer any questions that you do have. But it might be helpful if we have our presenters, and then it might also help you to frame your questions. But frame your questions as you go along, please, and use the chat. And when it comes down to it, you can also put your hand up. But what I'm going to do now is going to ask Marilyn to come in, and she's going to share experience. But before I do that, just to say thank you again, Dr. Olamide. She may not be able to stay until the end, so thank you again. That was a great presentation, much appreciated. So over to you, Marilyn.
Oh, thank you, Clive. And yeah, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for that. So what I'm going to just share with you, first of all, I'm going to set my stopwatch to make sure I don't get carried away, because I love talking about this subject. I know it sounds like an odd thing to say, but when I kind of decided 23 years ago, I said, one of the things I said to myself is I'm going to speak about suicide and other issues because I want it to be as commonplace as saying, yeah, I would have a herbal tea rather than a tea or coffee, because I realized how much judgment and stigma there was around it. So just to kind of take you back a little bit, we could go back as far as 1975 is where this kind of saga begins. But I contemplated suicide in September 2000. Now, at the time, I thought it was because and I would have said, if you'd said to me, if I had, you know, the wherewithal to talk about it, I probably would have said it was because my then partner had had an affair. However, I discovered when I got into personal development that it went way, way deeper than that. And it was very much, now this is just me, it's not saying that every single person who has suicidal thoughts, that it's down to childhood, etc. It just so happens that for me, that is where I would say the root of these problems started. And just for those who don't know, and before I say what I'm going to say, everybody can calm down. It's all good. I don't have anything around it. You know, I'm not triggered or traumatized by it. It's all sorted. But I was sexually abused from the age of 7 to 17, which of course fed into my sense of self, my sense of self-worth. It fed into already having lots of guilt and shame going on. And what I didn't realize at the time, because if you'd asked me again when I was in my teens, early 20s, I would have said, I've put that behind me. What I actually meant, if I had any knowledge of personal development and the way the mind works and mental health, I now know I kind of tried to put a lid on it and pretend it wasn't there, but it was always lurking in the background and like a dark cloud over my head, just, you know, waiting to spill out. So that's where it started for me. So in September 2000, as was already mentioned, I was looking through the phone book because I'd been sitting that day and contemplating how I was going to take my own life, and was quite analytical about it. Right, well, I could do that. No, can't do that because I can never tie knots at brownies. Could do that. No, I'm not going to be the person who makes people late for work. I could do no. And I was just going through a list, which now sounds, when I say it like that, people sort of think I'm being like comical about it, but that is totally how it was. I sat and I was working out what might be left after the things I knew I couldn't bring myself to do. And I was going through, then I thought, okay, I've heard of this thing called counselling. So I'm going through the phone book, and one of the first adverts I saw was for the Samaritans. So, and I thought, well, it's free. That's good. I wasn't working at the time. I was studying to be a chartered accountant. So I'd given up my job to go back to studies. I thought, free. So I pick up the phone, I ring the Samaritans, not knowing what to expect. I kept that poor volunteer on the phone for 4.5 hours. Now, the following year, once I sorted my head out, I became a Samaritans volunteer at the same branch. And I then realized that a Samaritan shift back in the day, I think they've changed the shift pattern now, is 4 hours. So if I caught that person just as they were going off shift, they gave me nearly 5 hours of their time. And when I realized that, I was like, you know what? I want to do this to help other people. So the following year, I became a Samaritans volunteer, where I was one of the people picking up the phone and saying, Samaritans, you know, how can I help you? So that's for me. So I often say I went from suicidal to Samaritans volunteer, because that's really kind of where the journey started for me. And the whole thing around personal development was not the most pleasant experience, I might say, because it's like holding up a mirror and you are being asked to reflect, to look at the issues, what we call in therapeutic terms in what I do, look at the root cause. So that was very difficult for me, because I was someone who was very quiet and very shy. What I now know, lacking in confidence, very low self-esteem. And one of the things that culturally, because we had a little bit of a mention of that in the video, and Clive, I really enjoyed the video. That was great. A really fantastic way to start. You don't want people up in your business. So you're not talk to people about what's going on. It's like, what on earth? So having to sit in front of someone, the Samaritans wasn't too bad because it was on the phone. But when I was in personal development and doing therapy, there's another human being sitting in front of me. And I've now got to, well, I didn't have to, but in order to make progress, I had to reveal things about myself that I'd never told another human being because I'd never spoken of the abuse. And when I was growing up, people used to call me stuck up because the perception was I was looking down on them and thought I was too good, to interact and to speak with them, etc. But what was really going on, I didn't want anyone close to me. I wanted to keep people at arm's length because my fear was they would find out the truth and what had been going on. And I don't know about everybody else, but I got to a certain age, a tipping point, even though this started when I was 7, when I hit about 12 or 13, somehow something flipped in my head and I started to think it was my fault. So there's all this stuff going on. So to have to come and sit with someone now and talk about it was awful. But I did it and it was very quick. So when I do breakthrough sessions with clients, we're often, for the first, I've been a coach and therapist now for the past 23 years at this point. That I started in October 2000. So this month is my 23-year anniversary. But for the first 9 or 10 years I was in practice, I just did one-day breakthrough sessions. So you come in the morning, sort your life out, whoosh, out the other end, have a nice life. And because that's the process I used. And so that's what I use with clients, which worked amazingly well. So people were blown away, first of all, that they could resolve things so quickly, because part of the mindset as well is that it's insurmountable. And that if you've had a problem a long time, or even your whole life, that it's going to take a long time and even your whole life to sort out. So that's one of the myths that I really wanted to bust as well when I started. So that's really kind of my journey into that. Now, a couple of things as we've been going through today and talking. In terms of, because people would then say, well, why did you call the Samaritans? You've got 3 sisters and you seem to get on really well. I'm like, yeah, we do. And we're back to, I don't want people in my business, because I realized that if I spoke to people that I knew, what has been said cannot be unsaid. And there might be issues, and there were a few, that were related to my sisters and to the people in the family. So now if I do that, I open up a whole can of worms. So that's why I didn't. But there was another thing. When I was growing up, it was that whole thing, something's wrong with you. Number one, I give you something to cry about. That was a common one. But pull your socks up. Don't have, all of those sorts of things permeated in my head. So I was of the mindset I should be able to sort this out. And if I just pull my socks up and pull myself together, I'll be fine. But it ran much deeper than that for me. Now, one of the things, I'm also a mental health first aid trainer, so I run free workshops for small businesses in Watford. So, that's organised by the Watford Chamber of Commerce with a grant from Camelot. So they paid for me to train as a mental health first aid trainer. In return, I run free trainings for businesses. One of the things we always say on the mental health first aid workshop is mental health is health. It's like physical health. Look, if I had a bandage on my wrist, I would feel no shame in turning up to this webinar and doing this. And I might even have a fun story or a badge of honor about how I hurt my wrist. No shame in that at all. But for some reason, people feel shame when something emotionally, physically, or psychologically is not where they would like it to be. So I'm really delighted we're having these types of conversations. Now, one of the things I would say that even when, because again, something else opened up when I started talking about this 23 years ago and working with people who had been sexually abused or who had been suicidal or had confidence and self-esteem issues, I realized another facet to this whole dynamic. There were people in the community who did not want me to speak of it, particularly the sexual abuse piece, because it was, potentially bringing shame on the family. I'm like, it's not to do with my family. I'm talking about my experience, but other people now were almost, how can I say, victim shaming me. So I had to put them straight on a few things. And one of the things I said, and I'll say it to anyone who wants to come and challenge me on it, I am not speaking out for people like yourself who have never been affected by this. I cannot let your discomfort get in the way of me speaking out to help those who may need help and support. So I had to make a decision. I had to sit with that for a while and go, oh my gosh, maybe I shouldn't speak about it. Maybe it is embarrassing. Maybe then people start thinking it was something to do with my family. But in the end, I was like, no, I'm not speaking to the people who have not been touched by this. I cannot let their discomfort get in the way of having these types of conversations. Another thing I would say in terms of the whole piece around it, because growing up, when I did not get over it until age 32. So if you'd see me at 31 years old, I probably would have said to you, there is no way that I can ever come to terms with this. There is no way that I can live a normal life. There is no way that I could ever let anyone know what happened. I'm, of course, clearly you can see I'm a completely different place now. One of the things I often say for people to know that they've resolved something like this, or they're at peace with the stigma that's attached to these things, is I will say, is it hidden, or is it just not appropriate for the situation that you're in? And what I mean by that is I don't rock up to dinner parties and go, hey, my name is Marilyn Devonish and I was sexually abused from age 7 to 17. How are you? Because it's not appropriate. I don't need to be in that, but I'm no longer ashamed of it. So if a conversation arose over dinner and it was appropriate for me to have that conversation, I've got no shame and no qualms in having that conversation. So for me, it's no longer shrouded in guilt and shame and all the rest of it. It's just about, is it appropriate to have this conversation? Is this the right time? But that in my head is when I knew things were resolved for me. Something interesting, just to kind of pick up on one of the points that was made in the brilliant presentation that's just gone before me, the age 45 to 64, my sister is a coroner. And we had a conversation about this in terms of suicide and coroners and, you know, joyful conversations one does sometimes have over dinner. And we were talking, and I was saying, do you know what? I said, we were talking about that demographic, that age group. We weren't talking about race and culture, it's about the age group. And I was saying, I wonder if it's because when men get to that age, particularly if they've retired or retirement is coming up, and it might be a sense of purpose is gone, or you might actually look at life and go, is this it? Is this what I've worked all my life for? So it's having those things in mind, because it seemed like an odd demographic straight off the bat. But when I really thought about it, I thought actually there's probably an element of that. And when I've spoken to people about it, of course, everyone will have their own reasons, but that was something that kind of came into the mix. So I would say to anyone coming up to that age, start getting some hobbies together, start, you know, making arrangements to be with friends and do things you want to do, the bucket list they call it. But I'd say, even though the bucket list is a bit of a fun term, it's actually really important. And one of the things I would also say to people who have been on the, let's say, left behind or touched by the aftermath of suicide, one of the things I know to be true from having sat with those thoughts and feelings myself, and having spent several years on the phone to people as a Samaritans volunteer, because people often go, oh, if only the coulda, what I call the coulda, shoulda, would have, I could have said this, I should have done that, what would have happened? And I say, look, you know what? You could run yourself around in circles for that. It's a very private thing. So it's, unless somebody was really awful to someone, I say 9.5 times out of 10, the decision was made. And just because you didn't call them on that day, or you didn't say the thing, or whatever, you could run yourself around in circles if they're already gone. So I just say, hold the space for people, be available for those conversations, but you cannot beat yourself up, because it is such a private thing. And one of the things I hear most often is the people who maybe do die by suicide are often the most unlikely, because they seem fine, they were happy, they were having a conversation, they were making plans, but they were also planning something else as well. And I know people often feel a lot of guilt when they've been left behind. So one of the things I would definitely say, coming back to the present day, because when I say to people about my past in child, because sometimes people go, well, what do you know about stress, or what do you know about anxiety? I'm like, take several seats, let me tell you. And so when I've had that conversation with people, one of the things they often say is, oh my gosh, I would never have guessed. And I say, that is my point exactly, that these are things that with the right help, support and resources, several of which were on the previous slide, there is help available, there is light at the end of the tunnel. And this is something that with that help and support, you can come back from. So like I said, I could talk for England and Barbados on this one. So I will leave it there. And Clive, thank you for the time and space, and I will hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. I think I've heard it every time I hear you speak, and every time you speak, I hear something different. I hear some additional stuff that I didn't know previously. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for being the kind of person that you are, that is willing to share your journey, because actually we don't have enough of it in our community. And actually is one of the problems that we have. So thank you very much for that. Favour, over to you now to share your reflections on anything else as a therapist in terms of what has been said so far, and anything else that you want to add. So, and you might also tell people a little bit about yourself too. So over to you, Favour.
Thank you. It's going to be a very hard act to follow up on Marilyn. Oh my goodness. You blew my mind. Like, you know, Clive said, each time I listen to you, I hear something new. And they are positive. That's the good news. And I'm so proud of you for being able to give us these nuggets and open up to your life to all of us. Like Clive said, this is what we lack in the community. So it's really good to have that lived experience angle, because regardless of how we talk about professionals, hearing it firsthand from someone who has traveled the road makes a lot of difference. So thank you so much for sharing that. So my reflections actually is that there was one day I asked someone that I was working in adult mental health. I went to Park Royal and I took a sample of the number of young men on that section in Park Royal. And the statistics were so glaring. They were mostly Black, African, Caribbean young men. And then in my caseload on the people that were in the community that I was going to see in their houses, when I look at the diagnosis, 60% of my caseload were schizophrenia and bipolar. And that schizophrenia and bipolar, out of that 60%, 50% will also be African Caribbean young men. As a matter of fact, I'm glad that we have a psychiatrist in the room. There was one diagnosis that gave one of my clients that was a white middle-aged man, dysthymia. And that that man, I remember in the MDT meeting we were discussing, the conversation was going towards diagnosing him around bipolar disorder or personality disorder, something like that. But he ended up with this particular diagnosis. And that was my first time of hearing that diagnosis then. And then those things began to, I began to reflect a lot on these things. And I asked myself, so I come from a country, I'm a first generation migrant. I came from a country where we were over 200 million people. And I'm just wondering if the proportion I'm seeing in England reflects, what Black people's experience are. Then that means out of that 200 million people where I came from, up to 50 million perhaps will be in a secure unit. So I was just kind of wondering, it was confusing to me. And then I continued my journey to understand mental health better. And then I went to study cognitive behavioral therapy. But one of the things that I've picked up over time in my practice, both as a CAMS manager and somebody that has worked in adults, is that there's something that is happening in the Black community, which we really need to address. And if you look at that presentation that was made, those socioeconomic factors are very, very obvious for us, especially in this country. So we've lost community. We've been separated a lot from our journeys, whether we are first or second generation, regardless of what point we are, or third generation. We've lost our community life. We've been separated from our family. And these are protective factors that kind of help us build resilience over time. And so we're in this new environment where we're struggling, to adapt ourselves, to adjust to the reality of where we are. And the pressures of trying to survive is overwhelming. on us, and particularly on the concept of masculinity when it comes to our males. And so these are factors that are actually playing out, apart from the biological factors that were listed there. Those socioeconomic factors are actually playing out a lot in our lives. It's not just playing out in mental health, it's also playing out in other aspects of our lives. If you go to the care system, Black children, BEM children are overrepresented. It's all over the place. So the police stop us more than they stop other people, just everywhere. So these are things that we cannot easily segregate and say it's because there's stigma in mental health in our community. Yes, there is, but there are factors that are impacting us more, that are making us much more vulnerable to cave into the realities of mental health challenges and suicide. The other thing I've thought about again is, because we're also always struggling, and if you look at that presentation, people that are low income, people that are unemployed, people that are going through criminal justice system, who are the people that are in these categories? Just think about it. And you see why we are all struggling and falling under pressure. One of the things as a therapist we tell people is, in your life you need to have a balance of things that give you sense of pleasure and things that give you sense of achievement. But for us, we haven't even got there. We're still struggling to survive. So for you to, I heard Marilyn when she said, if you're at that age, 45 to 64, maybe you should think about getting a hobby. So that you have something that kind of give you pleasure. But the reality is that for some of us, we are still even struggling to even think beyond that point. Is even difficult. When you're doing one shift, after one shift you go to another shift, after another shift you go to, you're struggling with to even survive and put food on the table for your family. So we're not even there to be balancing sense of achievement and sense of pleasure, and that's something that we really need to think about. Then the other thing I've also learned over time as I continue to work with clients is, even though we talk about talking therapy all the time, the reality of talking therapy, especially something like CBT that's quite common, is that these therapies were built, the evidence around them were quite Eurocentric, and they were not quite culturally adapted for us. And so most of the time when you encourage our people to engage in therapy and all that, they sort of disengage quickly. And when you dig into it, you discover that the way it's being delivered is not culturally adapted to us. But there are evidence now, there are developments, especially in CBT, that is, we're working hard to make sure that they are adapted. But this is the reality of the situation. And also the way we relate and the way we are and our lifestyle is slightly different. We are quite expressive. The way we engage each other, the way our storytellers is different from the way the evidence that built some of these therapies. So that's some of the challenges that we have that we need to look into. Then the last reflection that I had that I really want to talk about is the role of spirituality. This is something that in the Western world, people kind of struggle with in the terms of how typical Africans or Caribbeans may interpret some of these things. So sometimes when people are engaged in spirituality in the way they understand it, sometimes it's misinterpreted. And at the same time, religion plays a double role in the way it either maintains some of this stigma or these abuses, or provide protective factor to us. So that those dynamics that is playing out in our lives that needs to be unpacked for us to be where we need to be. And finally, for our adolescents, because I wouldn't conclude any conversation without mentioning adolescents, because I'm a camps manager, so that is my bread and butter. So for adolescents, our adolescents, like that movie that the first movie that we watched, where that young person was saying she couldn't tell her parents. The other thing is that I did a talk on Sunday. I was saying to a church about mental health. I said, our children are growing up in a different world from the world we grew up. They are Facebook children, they are Instagram children. Some of us didn't grow up with Facebook, some of us didn't grow up with Instagram. So the pressures they have is different from us. But the challenge for us is to understand how to support our young people better and begin to build resilience much earlier in our community, regardless of where our journeys are, to find a way to meet our young people halfway. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Favour, for that overview and for your perspective as a therapist. There is clearly hope for all of us, and that's part of the reason for us being here. You mentioned there about young people, for example, and it clearly is important that we think about helping those youngsters to develop the kind of resilience that is necessary. And I sometimes do concern myself that there's where there's been a gap. And some of you might recall that we operated a supplementary school, which we may well do again at some point. Part of the reason for that was to help our young people to develop that sense of self and that kind of sense of resilience that comes from that. I think it's still important and necessary. So thank you very much for that. Before we go to looking at the questions, and there's one that I would want to put, but I just, as Mosun is with us, I just thought I'd ask Mosun whether, having heard what you've heard, there's any reflection that you do want to share with us before we go and take questions.
Good evening, everyone. Yes, there's been a lot of talking. I think the first hour has been about talking, which is what we're very good at sometimes, professionals and people knowledgeable in various areas. I think it's important that we have a conversation, so we bring other people into the conversation at this point, because you find that people hardly sometimes have an opportunity to ask their questions, to have two-way conversations or three-way conversations. So I think we should use the latter half of this presentation tonight to do that.
Okay.
And obviously all the speakers except Dr. Olamide, Marilyn and Favour will be happy to answer questions. And I'll be here as well.
Okay. Okay, so I think what I think Mosun is saying, she'll come back later on after everybody's had their questions answered and maybe sharing their thoughts at that point, which is most welcome. And I think she's right. This is always intended to be about you and not just about 3 or 4 people who might be speaking and sharing their expertise. Because really, the saying that he who feels it knows it is really paramount and important. So, Marilyn, I don't know whether you saw any questions. I don't know if we should go through the chat and see what people have said. One thing I did want to ask, because it has been mentioned by a few people, but I'm not too sure. Favour mentioned this, and I think Dr. Olamide did also about CBT. Can somebody just explain what it is? Because not everyone will understand even what CBT means. Just as a kickoff, and then please, if you'd want to put your hand up for a question, there is the opportunity to put your hand up at the bottom of your screen, your reaction section. Please put your hand up. If you put something in the chat, we're going to go through all the points that people have made in the chat. With Marilyn's help, we're going to make sure everything is covered. So, so as you're with us, and you're on my screen, Mosun, I don't know if you want to just say, I know it's
okay.
Yes, I think you put it.
Yeah. So cognitive behavioral therapy. If you look in the chat, I've put what it means there. So there's 3 aspects of that. There is a 3-letter word, isn't it? Cognitive behavioral therapy. So I'm trying to break it down into simple language. So cognitive just means your cognition means the way you think, your executive functioning, your understanding, your intuition and the rest of it. So that's your cognition. And then behavior is how you react to what you hear, what you see, how you feel. And the therapy is the change that's required. So I'll give you a practical example. So it starts raining. Somebody else might feel, oh, thank goodness, I've been feeling so hot, and I'm just going to sleep. It starts raining and somebody else feels, oh my God, that means all the roads are going to be blocked. I'm never going to get to where I'm going. There's going to be a lot of traffic. That's it. I'm finished. I'm never going to get the job. and they start panicking and they start crying. And do you see what I mean? So the same event, but different reaction. So I've just used raining. It could be that you're delayed to an event and somebody feels, well, I'll relax and take a cup of tea, is probably for a reason. Somebody else feels delayed and, anxiety overwhelms them. They start screaming, no, they start thinking negatively. And so it's the same event. Somebody dies. The way we react to bereavement might be different. Somebody loses their job. A relationship breaks down. Somebody might feel, well, it's good riddance, goodbye. Somebody might think, oh my God, that's it. I'm finished. I can't make it without the other person. So that's your reaction. And the therapy is dealing with the negative reaction. So usually most people who are depressed, who are anxious, have a negative cognition to events. So the cognition, something happens, the way you think about it is negative. And then your behavioral manifestation would also be negative. The therapy is how to change your behavior and your feeling to the event into a more positive one. So cognitive behavioral therapy. There's people who are depressed, who are anxious, who got mental health problems, who are in crisis. They have negative cognition usually. It's always feeling of doom, impending doom, hopelessness, helplessness. There's a lot of, I can't make it, I have to end my life. Suicide is the only answer, things like that. So those are all negative cognition. And what you're trying to do in CBT is cognitive restructuring. So you're trying to change negative thinking. You're trying to change negative behavior into more positive one. And it's the therapy that is the action. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. Thank you very much for that. I know we've got some questions in the chat now. Marilyn, do you want to pick up with Virat?
Well, one of the questions I've just been asking, so Jay was asking, could I recommend any good books on the topic? So I was saying, number one, it depends on your personality, but one that I purchased in university now, it's a fantastic book. I didn't have let's say the mindset at that time to really take it on board, but it at least kind of cracked open the door. It was a book called Feel, F-E-E-L, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway by Dr. Susan Jeffers. It's an old classic. I purchased it in university. Depending on what sort of things you like, I quite like science, neuroscience, etc. So there is a really good book called The Biology of Belief by Dr. Bruce Lipton, and that talks about epigenetics. It also starts to explain something which we haven't necessarily touched on in a direct way yet, which I would call intergenerational trauma. So it explains how trauma can be passed down through the genes. And there are some really interesting studies in there. And of course, I've got loads of books. So depending on the style of book that you like, I can probably recommend something. But those two were really good starting points for me in terms of getting my head around the idea. And I also read a couple of books that were very much related to the therapies that I was studying. So there was something called Timeline Therapy and the Basis of Personality by Dr. Tad James. NLP Demystified, very tiny book, but it started to explain how the NLP stands for neuro-linguistic programming, but it started to explain how the mind and brain work. So I would say those hopefully will give you a few starting points. Now,
before you move on, I just wonder whether or not Mosun or Favour have any further suggestions. Maybe or maybe not. You can always put something in the chat.
And yeah, if anybody does, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, I think Favour will come in.
Thank you very much for the suggestions.
Okay.
You're most welcome.
Favour.
Thank you. No, I wanted to say I'm not always too quick to recommend books. I always want people to sort of speak to someone first to be able to understand where they're coming from. To be able to signpost them correctly, because I've discovered over time that when people have difficulty, they're desperate seeking for solution, and sometimes if they're not well guided, things actually get more complicated. So I'm always more eager to speak to someone one-to-one and be able to signposts. So I'm happy to for anybody to make contact with me.
Mosun, any thoughts on books?
Along similar lines, it's got to be individualized.
Okay, all right.
So from a clinical point of view, I would like to recommend books that are helpful and that can meet your particular needs, if that makes sense. So if person A finds a book helpful, you may not find it helpful if that's not what you require at that point in time. So I'll just be a bit careful, as Favour said.
But I do take it that what Marilyn was saying is from a general oversight on perspective.
Yes.
Looking at some of those bits of information to give you a little bit of a sense of what's happening. But I think if you are in need of therapy, then clearly a book is probably not necessarily where you're going to find a solution. Okay, sorry. I think the next question, Marilyn, was about how do you differentiate spirituality from hallucinations, visual or hearing voices as a professional? So who wants to pick that one up?
Should I go? I don't mind. So when you're doing your psychiatric training, you'd usually have some training about how to qualify hallucinations. Okay, so you'd learn about the different types of hallucinations: auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, olfactory hallucinations, tactile hallucinations, somatic hallucinations. There's lots of different types of hallucinations, and you'd be able to tell when something is normal or when they appear abnormal. More recently, we're beginning to learn about culturally appropriate interventions and culturally enlightened staff. And that's because of the environment where we find ourselves, where the thought of somebody saying they can hear God might be strange to some people. Whereas if you come from a Christian Pentecostal background, you'd fully understand the concept that somebody can say that they're hearing the voice of God. However, as a professional, if you have both understanding, then you'd be able to realize what might be spiritual, what might be spiritually acceptable, and what might be a symptom of a mental health problem or psychosis. That's why professionals who have an understanding, who have a cultural understanding, a spiritual understanding, as well as the clinical understanding, are probably less likely to make the errors than colleagues who are not culturally trained would make. And that's why it's important that that training is incorporated. So for example, spiritual hallucinations would usually be soothing. You know, it would have a biblical context to it. It would be experienced by other people. You know, there'll be an explanation to it within the spiritual context. That's why sometimes it's important to talk to the pastor or the imam, or to say, look, in your religion, is this, you know, conceivable, or is this normal? That's why, you know, when people talk about, you know, using contacting family and friends and relatives and your cultural beliefs and your religious beliefs, is to check whether that's even remotely possible within that cultural and religious context, where even your religious counterparts are saying, and your cultural, you know, relatives are saying, no, this is abnormal. Then obviously it's likely going to be a mental health problem. And if you then have the knowledge, clinical knowledge of how a psychosis that is of a mental health background or cause, then you'll be able to tease out the difference. So the voices will be external, they'll be disturbing, they will cause you agitation, and, you know, things like that. But whereas spiritual voices are usually soothing, there's a meaning to it, there's a context so that people can relate to it, and the rest of it. It's quite difficult to explain, but if you practically work with people who have this understanding, or you attend the training, then it's easier. And I think it's really, really important that people check. If you're working, you know, if you're seeing somebody that you think this might even be remotely possible within their cultural context or their religious background, please check. Please talk to other people. Don't make assumptions. Don't lock people up because they say they can hear from God or they're speaking in tongues, because that might be religious. Does that make sense?
Okay, that's fine. Don't make assumptions, I think, is the key there. Favour, you wanted to come in.
You're muted.
Sorry. No, the last sentence that Dr. Mosun said is what I wanted to say, that what has happened before now is a lot of assumptions has been made, and this is what is contributing to the misinterpretation of some of these presentations. So there's a fine line and professional judgment, clinical judgment to be made about some of these things, but the key thing is to do a holistic assessment. An assessment shouldn't just be about the person that is sitting in front of you and the biological signs of depression or whatever they're saying in front of you, whether they're psychotic or not. To do a proper history and a holistic assessment of the person is always useful. In the trust that I work now, they've now trained people we call cultural advocates. And what they help us in assessment, especially in camps, where we have to not just assess the young person, assess the family, and try to work out what is going on. So most of the time, because we may not be able to fully understand the cultural situations of some of the people that are living in inner London, these cultural advocates help us to understand what some things mean, some of the things we misinterpret, from our Eurocentric position or from our Christian perspective sometimes. They will help us to put it in context. And then they're also able to interpret what is clearly out of range within that particular culture. So it helps us to make appropriate judgment. But clinically, we know what we look at for when you are talking about hallucinations and psychosis, but we cannot in any way undermine people's religious experience, which are valid. In fact, the culture I came from, there are some people that, that are known to speak to the gods, in traditional way, not in Christian way. And they're known to be interpreting what the gods are saying. And they live perfectly normal life, and they're not psychotic in any way.
You're muted, Clive.
One thing I'll say while Clive is unmuting is regards to that as well, a bit like the book thing. What is one person's voices will maybe be, like you said, something that is perfectly normal for another person. One of the things I have noticed is that when we're kind of bridging into psychosis and that sort of area, the voices, when you really listen to what somebody is saying, those voices actually tend to be quite destructive in some way, shape or form. It will be maybe moving them away from things that might be helpful or healthy for them, or causing them to enact behaviors that are not necessarily helpful, good, right for them or the people around them. Whereas when it's something more spiritual, that voice is actually empowering rather than disempowering. It brings a, how can I say, it's almost like a lightness to it, and whatever is going on with regards to that, the actions that follow are something that is good and ecological and healthy for the person hearing the voices. And it also is something that brings something positive to the space and the people that are around them. So it's too simplistic to say one's light, one's dark, one heavy, one light.
Yeah.
But if I had to kind of just very quickly, in the context of this, that's kind of almost the way it plays out in terms of the psychosis is more dark, if that's the best way I can put it into words, I think, in a short space of time.
Okay, very briefly.
Clive, I think Nigel had his hand up.
Yeah, no, I will. No, we are going to come to the speakers, the questions in due course. But Favour, can you just explain what CAMS is? Because people watching this recording might not actually know what it's all about.
Oh, sorry, CAMS is Child Adolescents Mental Health Service. So that is the service that supports young people from young age to up to 18 years. Okay,
thank you very much. We're going to come back to Nigel in a minute, but we did have some other questions here that have been here for a while. So the next one says, some people are quite paranoid of how people perceive them or talk about them. Is this CBT or what is it? Or I can say they're very negative about everyone around them. So what is it? CBT or is it something else? Something else, I think, is a fundamental question.
Are they talking in terms of treatment? So in terms of personality, you can have
the person called is Irene. I don't know if you'd like to unmute Irene and maybe explain your question? I mean, I know it's written down here. Are you still with us? Irene Main?
They said personality. They're talking in terms of personality. I put it in the chat.
Right, okay,
Okay,
yes.
because
Okay.
it says CBT, I was wondering if it's in terms of treatment.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, thanks for clarifying.
Okay.
Yeah, some people might have what we call paranoid personality, and every day paranoid just means that you're afraid, you misinterpret, everything is negative. And you know, somebody puts something out because they want to harm you, they want to poison your food, they're gonna come and get you, you know, they're against you, the whole world is against you kind of thing. So paranoid. So you can be paranoid, can be full-blown psychosis as well. So for example, a category of schizophrenia is paranoid schizophrenia, but you can also have paranoid personality, just like you can have dependent personality, emotionally unstable personality disorder. And so depending on the degree of the paranoia, with every mental illness, you can have mild form of the illness, moderate, or severe. And that would also determine the treatment pathway. So what you might require if you've only got mild symptoms might be different from what you require if you've got moderate or severe. Obviously, some ends of the spectrum would need hospitalization. The milder forms you can be managed in your home, in community. The same goes for the arms of treatment. So we usually take a biopsychosocial approach. Biological means medication, psychological and social. Social just means taking away whatever the stressor is. Psychological, as we said, they're different from psychological therapies, biological medication. Not every form of mental illness would require medication. Possibly the moderate to severe end of the spectrum may require medication. Mild symptoms may not necessarily require medications. So for example, if somebody was to have a mild depressive disorder, you'd be recommending exercising, looking at their diets, you know, increasing their social network, reading books, self-help guidelines, CBT, and the rest of it. They may not require medication, whereas moderate to severe end of the spectrum would usually require medication. So paranoid personality disorder, personality is the same. So when we were talking about CBT, there's CBT for psychosis, there's CBT for depression, there's CBT for anxiety, if that makes sense. It all depends on what you're presenting with. So CBT can be a form of treatment for mild paranoid personality. What are you trying to do? Cognitive restructuring. So somebody picks up your cup. It doesn't mean they're trying to poison you. Perhaps they felt, you know, your drink was on a tip over, that's why they picked up the cup. Somebody didn't return your call. It doesn't mean they don't like you. They might be busy with work. They might be on call. They might, do you see what I mean? So that's cognitive behavioral therapy. So yeah, there can be CBT for psychosis, CBT for depression. Does that explain it? I could talk forever and don't want to digress.
It seems to make pretty good sense to me. The next question, I know Marilyn's left the books and we'll, I think we've seen that already. My friend's son tends to see things move in the house, like he will say a paper bag on the corridor is moved. Is this a concern to the parent? Is this a concern to the parent? He's perfectly fine and not stressed. And I think you partially answered that, Mosun. So you were saying there that when people
yes, I tried to answer that. So we are encouraging people to seek mental health support, but there is something that's really important. For every mental health diagnosis, it's important to rule out an organic cause, and I don't want us to lose sight of that. So some mental health symptoms can be triggered or caused by physical health problems. So somebody might have an infection, they might have what we call delirium, they can start to see things, they can see things moving, they can hear noises and voices and the rest of it. It's very important that even though you might feel it's a mental health problem, they have to be physically checked out. First, you must seek support from the physician, from your GP, from A&E, blood test, x-rays, you know, investigations, to check that it isn't a physical health problem that's causing that. Because if you ignore or if you miss a physical health problem, they're not likely to get better if you're giving them mental health medication. Because just giving somebody antibiotics to treat an infection or giving somebody sugar who is in an hypoglycemic state, you know, and they're having tremors and they're shaking and they're sweating, and you think, oh God, they've got severe anxiety. No, they've only got hypoglycemic crisis. Just give them a sugary drink, they'll be fine. You don't need to give them, you know, anxiety medications and benzodiazepines and the rest of it. So it's really, really important. Somebody might have a tumor in their eyes and, you know, it's affecting their visual fields and they're seeing things in the corner of their eyes. You start to give them antipsychotic medication instead of doing an x-ray, instead of treating the tumor, you're going to miss it. So I can't overemphasize this. There's what we call physical and mental health disparity in care. So for many years, once people present to A&E and they've got a history of mental health problem, oh, they're just packed to one side, you know, it's their mental health. And because of that, many people with mental health problems have their physical health issues missed because people don't pay attention to them. They think, oh God, they're in mental health crisis again. So that's why they have a shortened and reduced lifespan compared to the general population without a mental health problem. Then obviously it's a confounding, there are lots of factors that cause that, but people with mental health problems are more likely to die from a physical health cause because of some of the things we're describing now, either because people feel, oh, they just assume it's their mental health and they don't have the right checks, or, you know, they're just relegated to the background. So please, please, please seek support first. Be objective, open-minded, find out the cause.
Thank you very much. Before I go to one question I can see in the chat, Nigel, apparently you wanted to come in. Nigel, welcome. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. And obviously, I apologize. I missed the beginning, the first presentation, which apparently is very good. And obviously, it's been interesting for me to hear the discussion, especially obviously on mental health and how it affects the Black community. I obviously just need to learn and listen. But I did put a piece in the chat, which I know is totally off this, just saying that because I'm on the Children's Services panel at County Council, and I'm also actually on adult care, one thing I did raise last week, and I know this is more about the youth justice system coming more back to youth rather than, if you like, older people, but there's a very long word called disproportionality, which is used in the report. But what that meant, as I said in the chat, is that sadly, there's an age group of 10 to 17-year-olds, 10 to 17-year-old of Black youth, Black men, young teenagers and males who are disproportionately in the figures in our youth justice in Hertfordshire, as well as maybe other counties, but certainly in Hertfordshire. And therefore, I raised last week at full council and at Children's Services panel how they can tackle that, the kind of things they need to learn and that officers, county officers and social workers need to learn and understand about the FOCAB committee if they haven't already learned it, to try and tackle this disproportionate, if you like, arrests or taking into custody of the youth. Unfortunately, the Black youth, there's far too many. And so I just wanted to put that out there because this is officers are saying they are taking it up. There's training going on for social workers and others. But I think it's just something I felt needed to be said at full council last week. Sorry if that's going off the general mental health talk, which is good.
No, Nigel, thank you very much. I think it's very helpful. It'd be interesting to know a bit more because it might be something that we need to talk about a bit more at the association, one of our meetings. Thank you very much.
Get it sent on.
There is the next question is that can you speak to the lack of discussion and communication? The Black.
Oh, did you want? Sorry, Clive. Did you want us to comment on Nigel's?
Oh, yes, please do.
Because, and so I just want to mention some of the factors. Obviously, it's not going to be everything, Nigel. Sometimes you were talking about disproportionate number of Black 17-year-olds and teenagers being arrested by the police. Okay, there are many factors for that. We obviously some of it is individual to the culture, to the race. But I wanted to point out some of the establishments as well. There's disproportionate penalty as well. It's been known that there might be disproportionate penalty for the same offense. So, for example, a 17-year-old from another background who commits an offense may get a slap on their wrist, whereas the Black person gets arrested and gets taken to custody. Okay, so there is a bit of that playing up. And then there's lack of cultural awareness of their behavior. So there's an assumption that the Black person is going to be violent, and so the police might be high-handed from the start, which then might lead to an equivalent reaction from the Black child, and then they get arrested whereas they might approach a white kid or somebody of another ethnicity by having a conversation. The criminal justice system or the police may feel that the best way to talk to a Black kid is to arrest them first. And when you arrest them, what does that cause? Agitation. I'll give you a practical example within the mental health setting. So I did my training in a part of the country where, as a psychiatry trainee, we go out to do mental health act assessments, and some people would call them the sectioning squad. So if you were worried about somebody's mental health, you'd go out with a social worker, an AMP, 2 independent doctors, and then you assess the situation and determine whether the person can be asked to come into hospital voluntarily, or whether they need to be sectioned to hospital, or they just stay at home and take medication, or you advise them what they require. Now, I was on call that night and we had 3 assessments, okay? 2 white British males and 1 Black African male. We went to the white British patient, we assessed them, and the police was not required. We read the notes, we went to the house, did the assessments, and off we went with our recommendation. We went to the second white British male, went to their house, did not feel we needed the police. When we were on our way to the 3rd patient, which was a Black African male, suddenly the AMP was ringing the police. We had exactly the same information as we had for the other 2 patients, but the AMP was ringing the police this time. And I just couldn't get my head around it at the time because I was a junior trainee and I didn't know what I know today. And I'm like, why did they think there was an assumption that that Black guy was going to be violent? And so they needed the police for protection. So we weren't going to be approaching the 3rd patient unless we had the police accompany us. And we waited for hours so we could get the police. And of course, when we got to the house, the mom was like, why have you come with the police? I've only called you because I was worried about my son. She said, what are you doing here? Get out of my house. I didn't want the police. And the boy who came downstairs and saw the police then became agitated. So tell me, what caused the agitation? And are you surprised that the boy got arrested and sectioned that night? Do you think things could have gone differently if we had approached that house as we did for the other white British patients without calling the police? So these are some of the factors that may not necessarily be talked about. So it just needs to be borne in mind. So yes, I just thought I'd comment on that.
That's good. Thank you.
Absolutely. Did either Marilyn or Favour need to say anything more about that? Because what I would say is that, yes.
I wanted to agree with Dr. Mosun. In the council chamber, is it this week or last week, we had full council, Marilyn can confirm that. I highlighted some of these factors in terms of mental health inequality for African Caribbean people. And that's why I said initially that it cuts across everywhere. Most of our young people, young men, enter mental health through the criminal justice system. It's not because they are the worst offenders in the country. It's because of this concept of dangerousness of the African male. And that's why I cried out to say that we need to begin to support our adolescents, because it's these adolescents that will grow up to be men. So if we begin to criminalize them for very little things at this stage, we can imagine what we do to their mental health eventually. There was a case that was on radio and TV all over the place in this country this last week of a young boy that was riding his bike with this water gun, and police handcuffed him because, so these are, real situations. But the issue is that it's also feeding into the mistrust that is created in the community from engaging with mental health services itself. Because if at any point we have to enter through sectioning, so anytime you talk about mental health, people will think that I don't want to be sectioned. So these are the realities of the situation. So it would be good that we begin to build cultural appropriate practice, in the diversity of the community we serve in Watford and in Hertfordshire.
I think let's call it out, because it seems to me that pretty clear that if you look across the piece, whichever section you look at, we face racism, and actually it manifests itself in various ways. I'm not too sure how you pronounce your name, but Liana's I think wanted to come in.
Okay, I'll come in after Liana.
Hi, my name's actually Shelley, but I am the founder of Liana's Wish.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I was just interested in what Nigel Bell was saying about disproportionality. I worked in criminal justice for 15 years, and prior to that, I worked for an assertive outreach team in Brent. And when does it end? That's my question. Is like, we all know what needs to change, but how do we make the changes to the things that people are talking about now that people raised sort of 20 years ago? The issues of the lack of cultural awareness and disproportionality, and the fact that we're overrepresented in every area that has a negative outcome, a negative connotation to it.
Mosun, as your consultant psychiatrist with us, can you see an end? What is the end?
What do we do? How do you stop yourself from losing? You want to make changes and stuff, and you're working with the commissioners and the people who are in positions to make change for our people. And what do you do? Could you just go around in circles all the time?
Yeah. So far that's what's been happening, unfortunately, Lena. It's Shirley, sorry. It's not changing, and you can see why some people lose.
Yeah. Okay, that's why I left you justice. I've done some amazing programs, won awards, but the awards don't do it for me. The awards just don't do it for me. I just want to see change. And I was like, when is there going to be an insight? Because people say the same thing over and over and over again, and in the meantime, our people are dying.
What I would say, from my perspective, I suspect the solution is multifaceted. Some of it is about our community, some of it is about our family, some of it is going to be about changing the institutional racist frameworks that we're having to exist within. Now, I say that in relation to that latter point, it requires all of us, people like Nigel, who is a wide supporter of our activities, and people like him in the white community, to acknowledge that there is some real problems around race and racism, and actually seek to do all that they can to ameliorate that particular problem. For ourselves, we also need to reflect on some of the things that we used to do that used to support the community. In the African concept of it takes a village to raise a child is also relevant to our community. We need to come together to look at how we support each other. And that's not just the immediate family, that's got to be the extended family and the community working together. Part of our problem is that we've lost that community, that sense of community that we used to have in the 50s and 60s. And we need to recover a bit of that in order to support each other. We need to look at the education of our children. We need to improve and have a curriculum that's more reflective of our realities. But in the absence of that, we also need to look at how we come together to educate our children, to develop a sense of self within them, on all of those kinds of things. However, I don't want to go on my soapbox about that kind of thing for too long. Does anyone else want to say anything about what do we do?
Well, one of the things I would definitely just say is it gets, it feels like it gets old. It's like, I've been talking about this for so long, but it's the whole thing about, the stereotypes that we hold, and everybody holds certain stereotypes. But it made me think of an advert from The Guardian in the 1980s. It was a TV advert. Now, it actually featured a skinhead, but it was about perspective and points of view. So you see the advert and there's a skinhead running like he looks aggressive, and there's a little old lady walking along, and then it cuts back to him, and then you see a little old, and cuts back to him, and you think the worst is about to happen, and then he lunges forward, and then they pan back, and there's like a canister of paint or something that's going to fall on the woman who's walking in the street. But that advert was brilliant because it immediately played into stereotypes, and you come to an assumption, and it's still on YouTube. I just checked to make sure it's still available. And so I'd say with regards to this one, many of the Black women here probably know the angry Black woman thing, when you're just talking passionately about something and people get all defensive, and you're not being aggressive. You're just like, you've got a strong point of view and you want to get your point across. So I would say in the situation that the doctor mentioned, it would now come down to all of those people, regardless of what color they are, going out to that call. And if you've had two things go one way and another way. Somebody has to stand up and go, why are we treating this one any differently? The criteria appears the same. What's going on here? And it's that whole thing now about actually standing up and saying, well, hang on, we've just done 1, 2, 3, 4. And with this one, which is the same, we're doing A, B, C, D. We need to just look at what we're doing here, because the whole thing now about, letting things slide, it might be in my imagination. I think those days, we're way or beyond them. So I think the speaking up and pointing out, or at least just clarifying. Can I just clarify? We are taking a different approach with this case. Can you just clarify with me why that is? And asking people for the data, for the actual information, and rooting out. And sometimes it will be as bold as saying, well, actually, I would actually put on the table that perhaps we're treating them differently because we have some stereotypical ideas, because people are often afraid of just the sheer strength and presentation of a Black man. We know that to be true as well. So I'd say, those in those positions, challenging those things when you see them, like Nigel has been talking about, like Favour has been talking about, because I think, it's time to gently and sometimes forcefully bring these things to people's attentions, because we all know unconscious bias is very real and it's pervasive. So that's just what I would say on that one.
Shelley, just coming back to you for a moment. Did you have any? Do you have any thought yourself about what we should or could?
Yeah, I was saying, I think that, I think historically, I think even going back to 20 years ago when I was sitting in court, when I was working in youth justice, I had white allies sitting alongside me who also witnessed and acknowledged the same things that were happening. They could see the injustice and the way that two very similar crimes were treated differently. So again, is it maybe how do we encourage more of our white allies to speak out for us? Because for me personally, it's one of those things that I can't just wake up tomorrow and decide, okay, well, it's a bit too hard, it's a bit too difficult, this is a bit too difficult. I can't just decide not to do it. And so, and I say every time that some change has been made, it's been in partnership and collaboration. It's been with white people, by our side, because we can't do it by ourselves. But it's about changing. I just don't know I just know that the things you're talking about, the things that I was in meetings about 20 years ago, and I was in conferences 20 years ago, and I said, when do these things actually change? When will it be legislated for? When will there be a mandate for things to change? What you said about how us coming together and educating our children, because actually Liana's wish, one of the things that we have done is we have just focused on community, and it's just doing it for ourselves, really. We've got a Saturday school for our young people. We've got a community cafe on a Tuesday for people again in the local area. We have social evenings, but it is literally I can't rely on anybody else really to change things for us to improve the outcome. So it's about bringing the community together and doing it ourselves. Now, we have got a really high suicide rate in the area that I live. There was a suicide in April, and actually one of our beneficiaries went and cut down the body. I know there's a lot of suicides, and where there is suicide, there's many, they tend to follow. So we've got suicides, and we're in an area of high deprivation, and it's multicultural. So right now I'm at the point where, I've worked in every single institution. Right now we're working with the police and Safer Neighbourhood, and they've come on board and they're helping. They're getting engaged with the young people, because I want it to be again like, back in the day when you knew your police officer, because if they know you, they're less likely to treat you in a bad way. They know your mum and that sort of stuff. So we're really trying to work on that, but it is a lot. How do we get more people on board is what I want to say.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful question that we're trying to answer too, Shelley. Just to say, just because I think this next question does link to what has been said already, which is probably about what can we do. And it's can you speak to the lack of discussion and communication in the Black community spaces, especially in the churches, and how can we change this? Also, do we reach out to older men to be able to have these conversations around mental health? Some great questions there, three different questions. I don't have the solutions. Does anyone have the solutions to those? Because if I did, we'd probably be in a different place. I've been on this campaign for over 40 years, particularly the latter one about engaging Black men. You just have to look at this call today to see the predominance of women. However, does anyone want to address anything?
I will speak to the first part. To engage. Well, Dr. Pearl, thank you for your question. this program that Hertfordshire County Council kindly funded, I reached out to one of the bigger churches, predominantly Black churches in Watford, and luckily they embraced it, and they've rolled out a program. I was with them on Sunday, and it was quite a full house, and everybody was engaged. Throughout the week, they had one thing or the other to promote awareness of mental health and suicide prevention and all that. And there were quite a lot of pastors in the house as well. On Sunday there. The things are coming around, it's moving, the change, the wheel of change moves slowly. It's coming around, the faith leaders are beginning to, the pastors are beginning to appreciate that, that concept of, because you're a Christian, you cannot have mental problem, you cannot be depressed. That's been thrown off the burner at the moment. So they are beginning to key into it, but it's still a long way, a long walk ahead. So yes, we are getting the pastors and the churches to be partners in this journey, because at least I'm part of this one that is rolling out over a whole year in Watford.
Thank you. I have to say, I spoke to a pastor recently, and his solution seems to be that we just have to pray about it. I'm afraid we've been doing that for quite a long time. Anyone else wanted to come in?
One of the things, Clive, do you remember we did one of these about prostate cancer, and you had the gentleman who was the mechanic?
That's right, yes. Yeah.
So what was his name again?
I think his name was Errol, is it McCullough? Yeah.
But that concept, because for people who don't know, one of the things he would do, and men would bring their cars in to be serviced, he would get chatting about prostate. And eventually, by the end of that interaction, and by the time the car's done, the oil's changed, whatever it is, they just find themselves booking themselves in for a prostate cancer check. And he had people who had were at risk or had prostate cancer. It was just about to get serious. They would not have gotten tested if it wasn't for him. So I'm thinking now of the old, the barbershop style. I mean, Desmond's, I think, still comes on TV somewhere on the channel. But I think the spaces where men of a certain age are congregating, it's almost like you're going to have to infiltrate those spaces with a couple who are on board with this, who are having these types of conversations, and those are maybe spaces where they wouldn't necessarily be on a webinar, a Zoom call like this, but they are getting their hair cut, or they are buying whatever it is they're buying. And I think that is one of the routes and avenues. It comes back to the village concept again as well, but for a different demographic, because I always think those stories are really powerful. So that is one thing that comes to mind. And coming to the church, I'm probably not the right person to ask, because I'm normally in church for an occasion rather than being there every week. But I do know, in terms of my background, all the rest of it, is that sometimes the churches are a little bit open-minded, a little bit closed-minded, and I would like to think that their minds are now opening, and there is less stigma about these things and less shame about them. But if there's not, then I would say that's where, because they're powerful in terms of the word of a pastor. And I was at something for menopause awareness, and there was a pastor there who had come to support one of the speakers, and we were delighted because we were saying, wow, number one, a man, and number two, he can now take those conversations back to the congregation, back to the parish, and he will maybe be pivotal in not necessarily speaking to the women, but speaking to the men who are impacted by this. So I would say some of those conversations are more grassroots than legislation and booklets and all the rest of it. So that's the way I would see some of this permeating.
It looks like we could carry this debate on all night. I can see a few more questions and comments, one of which says that we need to call out stigma and imbalance in the care system. And I think, without going into that, I think clearly that's something that we have to do. As an organization, we will make a commitment that if we hear about those things, we are going to take it up, and we're going to make sure we call it out as much as we possibly can. Because yes, sitting in silence, sitting on the fence is not the way in which we bring about change. Just going on, I see that somebody says, although there is all this resource, the challenge is accessing the support when an individual has not consented. This has become an issue, especially for young adults, I imagine. So, Mosun, I think that's something really for you. People who are not consented, is there anything that can be done apart from sectioning somebody?
It depends. So as I said before, it depends on the severity of the symptoms and the perception of risk or harm, either to themselves or to other people. You have to bear that in mind. So for every mental health assessment you do, you have to do a risk assessment. And when you're doing a risk assessment, it's in two forms: risk to self, risk to others. What are the sort of things they're presenting with? Are they just mild symptoms, inconsequential? Are they moderate symptoms or severe? And has it started to cause harm either to themselves or to people around them or even to the general population? So that was what would determine whether you're buying time, you're being conservative in your approach, using the least restrictive options, or you're considering a full mental health act and compulsory treatment. So I imagine that it's easy to say these things, but that's the general approach to taking action.
Okay, and I see there's the observation again about calling it out, and I think I agree entirely with the final point that is made by, I think it's Temitope, which is we should not keep things quiet, because in fact that does feed the shame and the narrative, which is what we want to combat. So yeah, we certainly need to do that. Kim, yeah, we need to take action, and part of our reason for doing this as an organization is very much a part of that. We really have to be part of the solution, because otherwise we're part of the problem. In terms of and yes, somebody's happy to collaborate with us. Somebody wanted to come in. Is someone speaking? Okay, so what I'm going to do, because actually we are coming to the end, I'm just going to go to our speakers and ask them for any final comments. We will make a note of the observations that has arisen from here, because we're about seeking to see what we can do as an organization to make a difference, a positive difference for our community. So I'm going to end with you, Mosun, but I'm going to start with Marilyn. Anything you want to say before, and then go to Favour, and then to Mosun to finish off.
Okay, well, one quick thing I might say, on a more cheery note, we do have a few more events coming up, so I'll just maybe say a few words, Clive, about that, if that's all right.
Yes, please do.
So today's the 23rd. So we have got Thursday, the 26th of October, Children's Storytelling Workshop at Oxley Library. That's from 12 p.m. till 1 p.m. Sunday, the 29th of October. I mean, you've all got to be there for this one. It's the Black History Month Whacker virtual quiz, which is always amazing. And then on Tuesday, the 31st, we have an audience with local Black women writers. So the quiz is at 6:30 p.m. on Sunday, the 29th of October, Tuesday, the 31st, 6:30 p.m. Again, both of these are on Zoom, an audience with local Black writers. And of course, it's Black History Month, so we have a concentration of events. But as those of you who are already members or have come to these before, we run events throughout the year, oftentimes on Zoom. You are all welcome, regardless of your race, your background, your nationality. So it'll be absolutely wonderful to have you there. So that's that. But in terms of this conversation, I just want to say I'm always just delighted to be part of these types of conversations where we're speaking about mental health, we're speaking about well-being, we're speaking about issues that affect our community. And one of the things I would say for those of you who have been listening, number one, thank you so much for showing up. We've had a fantastic turnout tonight. And also for those of you who are watching this as a replay on YouTube or wherever you find it, if you come up, or no, let me say, when you come up with some solutions, please let us know, because we're always happy to hear those. And oftentimes it might even spark another one of these conversations, which takes us in a slightly different direction. So yeah, just wanted to say that. And thank you, Clive, as always, for organising, moderating, hosting, etc. And thank you to all of our speakers, because I think it's been a really great conversation. I've learned a lot, been reminded of a few things, and it's always wonderful to have some good conversation and healthy debate. So Clive, back to you.
Thank you, Marilyn. Favour, your final words?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, everyone that joined this night. This is a very important conversation, and I'm glad that we really had a good turnout this night, and you made out all the time to be part of it. The only last thought I want to leave is that it's good to talk. You know that strap line, time to talk, is good to talk. Please talk. And also the second thing is, let's build ourselves as a community. Like I started by saying, we lost community, and that's part of the real challenge we have. We cannot afford to fail our children. We can't afford to fail the next generation. Let's start building community again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Favour. Dr. Mosun.
Thank you, everyone. Again, I would say echo what everyone said. I just and I know Marilyn mentioned something about balance in the conversation, and it's really, really important for me to say this, because many times when I join meetings like this, there might be a tendency to externalize the problem. It's other people. It's because of what other people did to us or didn't do to us. So just to bring a bit of balance, I would like to say that it is actually true that the Black community are late presenters. We do not seek help on time. It's not being made up. I appreciate that there are several factors that may be responsible for this, but some of it is cultural, some of it is religious, socioeconomic status, being, thinking about the research inequalities that we've had before, racism and the rest of it. But at some point, if we continue to dwell on what other people have done and externalizing the blame, it's just going to be factors and reasons why we'll not seek the help. And you can see where negatively being impacted, our generation, generations before us, after us, our children. So it's really, really important that we don't lose sight of the internal factors. What are we responsible for? What can we change? So we're looking at other people to change the institutions, the establishments, the organizations, but what can you change? What are you going to take away from this meeting tonight in your household, to those you have around you, within your local communities, your social networks? What are you going to do? Don't forget, your voice is equally powerful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mosun. And let me just say a thank you to all of our speakers. From my perspective, it has been a superb conversation. But mostly, actually, I want to thank all of you, because actually we could just be talking to ourselves, and we haven't been doing that this evening. And for me, that's been great. As Marilyn has pointed out, we, as an association, is your organization. We'd like you to kind of take ownership of it. If you live in the area, Watford, the surrounding areas, please join us. We'll put our website details in the chat, because there you can become a member and various things, because our motto is together we can achieve. This is the beginning, well, not the beginning, this is one other piece of conversation that we're having about this particular issue. And it's not the end of the conversation, because we have to talk about this. I think Dr. Mosun just said there, I think there is a need to reflect on what other people have done and what other people continue to do. But that won't entirely provide a solution. We have to think about what it is that we can do ourselves, individually, as families, as communities, so that actually we are doing everything that we can to create an environment that will reduce and, as far as possible, eliminate these issues of mental challenges and ultimately the possibility of suicide in our community. So I said thank you all for being a part of this conversation. If you want to be part of continuing the conversation, I've seen some email addresses in the chat. Please put them in there. We will actually keep you informed about what is going on. But thank you all for joining. We hope you have a good rest of the evening. And to our speakers, Dr. Mosun, Favour, Marilyn, people are still coming in, I see. Don't worry about it. We are going to share the recording. So by tomorrow, hopefully, you should have downloaded and we'll be able to share it with you also. If you leave your email address, we'll send that across to you too. So thank you, everybody, and have a great evening. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Clive and Waka.
Thank you.
Thank
Wonderful.
you, everyone.
Well done.